March 1943. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. The train slowed to a stop in the middle of nowhere, high desert stretching in all directions beneath a sky so wide it felt like drowning. The Italian prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, peering through iron bars at a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Behind them lay the war, the North African desert, the surrender at Tunisia, the long voyage across the Atlantic in the dark belly of a transport ship. Ahead lay wire and wooden towers and men with rifles who did not speak their language. They had expected punishment. They had expected humiliation. Many had expected to die. Instead, when the boxcar doors opened and they stumbled into the cold mountain air, blinking against the brightness, American guards handed them wool blankets and pointed toward rows of barracks that looked cleaner than most of the villages they had left behind in Sicily or Calabria. The contrast was so jarring that some men stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. One young soldier from Naples, barely 19, kept touching the blanket as if it might vanish, as if generosity itself were some kind of American magic trick. The camp sprawled across flat ground at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, enclosed by double fences and guard towers but organized with a precision that felt more like a military base than a prison. Inside the wire, neat pathways connected identical wooden structures. Latrines with actual plumbing. A mess hall large enough to seat hundreds. Recreation areas marked out for football and bocce. It looked less like captivity and more like a strange, disciplined village where everyone wore the same clothes and no one could leave. For men who had spent months living in trenches, surviving on stale bread and rancid olive oil, sleeping in mud with lice crawling through their hair, the sight was incomprehensible. War had taught them that survival meant scraping by, that dignity was a luxury reserved for officers, that the enemy would strip you of everything the moment you surrendered. Yet here they were, being processed like factory workers, given identification cards, assigned bunks with actual mattresses, told in broken Italian that they would receive 3 meals a day and medical care if needed. The psychological dissonance was profound. These were men who had been raised under Mussolini's rhetoric, told that Italians were warriors descended from Rome, that surrender was cowardice, that Americans were soft and decadent and unworthy of respect. Now they stood inside an American camp, warm, fed, and more comfortable than they had been in months. The cognitive clash between propaganda and reality began immediately, a slow unraveling of everything they thought they knew. Camp Trinidad was one of hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States during World War II, part of a vast system designed to house captured Axis soldiers far from the fighting. By the war's end, more than 400,000 German and Italian prisoners would pass through American camps, alongside smaller numbers of Japanese captives. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, transforming rural towns and agricultural regions into temporary homes for men who had crossed the ocean to fight and found themselves instead living behind wire in places they had never heard of. But Trinidad was different in one crucial way. It would become a place where something unexpected happened, where the mechanics of captivity gave way to something more complicated, more human. Where men who had been enemies began, slowly and against all logic, to build something resembling community. Where barbed wire became less a barrier and more a boundary around a world unto itself. The first days were mechanical. Roll calls at dawn, the names mispronounced by American sergeants who struggled with Italian vowels. Work assignments handed out without explanation. Rules delivered in English and translated haltingly by a prisoner who had lived in Brooklyn before the war and spoke both languages with equal imperfection. The men shuffled through routines, unsure of what was expected, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It did not drop. Instead, the rhythm of the camp settled into something predictable. Breakfast at 6, watery oatmeal and coffee that tasted like dirt but was hot. Work details departing at 7, some men heading to nearby farms to harvest sugar beets, others assigned to camp maintenance or kitchen duty. Lunch delivered in metal tins. Afternoons spent in labor or, for those not working, in the recreation yard where men kicked a football back and forth or sat in the shade playing cards. Dinner at 5, usually stew or beans with bread. Evening roll call. Lights out at 9. The monotony was almost comforting. For soldiers who had lived with the constant threat of death, who had survived artillery barrages and strafing runs and the random cruelty of combat, the sheer boredom of camp life was a revelation. Days passed without violence. No one screamed at them. No one beat them for moving too slowly. The guards were firm but not cruel, enforcing rules with the detached professionalism of men who had been told to maintain order but not to brutalize. Still the wire remained. It defined everything. Inside was safety, routine, a kind of suspended existence where the war felt distant, almost abstract. Outside was America, a country most of them had never seen and could not understand. At night, some men stood at the fence and stared out at the lights of Trinidad, a small town glowing in the darkness, and wondered what kind of place this was. They had been told America was weak, divided, consumed by materialism and racial strife. Yet the guards had clean uniforms and new boots. The trucks that transported them to work details ran smoothly. The food, though plain, arrived on schedule. It was not paradise. It was captivity. But it was captivity with rules, with predictability, with small mercies that accumulated into something larger. And as the weeks passed, as the men settled into routines and began to learn the rhythms of the camp, something unexpected began to happen. They began to talk. It started with names. Prisoner 32941, an infantryman from a village outside Rome, became Giovanni when the American doctor treating his infected leg asked what his mother called him. The question was so simple, so ordinary that Giovanni answered without thinking. The doctor nodded, wrote it on a chart and said, "Well, Giovanni, you'll be fine in a week." The use of his actual name, spoken by a man he was supposed to hate, lingered in his mind long after the infection cleared. Names mattered in ways the camp administration had not anticipated. The system was designed for efficiency, for processing masses of men through paperwork and labor assignments and medical checks. Prisoners were numbers on rosters, statistics and reports sent to Washington. But the guards and officers at Trinidad, many of them farmers and shopkeepers from Colorado and New Mexico who had been drafted into managing this strange operation, could not sustain the impersonality indefinitely. A guard named Corporal Hayes, a rancher's son from Durango, began addressing the kitchen crew by name after the Italian cooks started preparing meals that actually tasted good, improvising with limited ingredients to turn army rations into something almost edible. He learned to say "Buongiorno Marco" and "Grazie Antonio," not out of affection but out of the simple recognition that these men worked hard and deserved acknowledgement. The gestures were small, almost trivial, yet they accumulated into something larger. Recognition is a powerful thing. To be seen, to be addressed as a person rather than a number, to have someone remember that you exist beyond your function in a system, these are the threads that weave humanity back into captivity. The Italian prisoners, most of them conscripts who had never wanted to fight, who had been swept into Mussolini's wars and abandoned in the desert when those wars collapsed, responded to this recognition with a cautious reciprocity. They learned the guards' names in return. They noticed which sergeant preferred his coffee black and which one liked sugar. They observed routines, habits, small human details that transformed faceless authority into individuals. The guards were no longer just the Americans. They became men with families, with opinions, with quirks. Corporal Hayes always whistled the same tune when he walked the perimeter at dawn. Lieutenant Brennan had a bad knee and walked with a slight limp. Captain Morrison carried a photograph of his wife and showed it to anyone who asked. This mutual recognition did not erase the fundamental inequality of the relationship. The guards had rifles. The prisoners had none. The guards could leave. The prisoners could not. But within that structure, small spaces opened up where interaction could occur on slightly more equal terms. A shared cigarette during a work break. A joke translated awkwardly through gestures. A conversation about farming techniques between a Colorado rancher-turned-guard and a Sicilian farmer-turned-prisoner who realized they had more in common than either had expected. Work assignments became another unexpected avenue for connection. The sugar beet harvest in the surrounding fields required intense labor, back-breaking work that the local farmers could not complete alone with so many young men deployed overseas. Italian prisoners, organized into work details, were trucked out daily to help bring in the crop. The farmers watched them at first with suspicion, unsure whether enemy soldiers could be trusted with honest labor. But hunger and exhaustion and the rhythm of agricultural work have a way of cutting through ideological barriers. A man pulling beets in the sun is just a man pulling beets, regardless of what flag he fought under. The Italian prisoners, many of them from agricultural backgrounds, worked with a competence that surprised the farmers. They knew how to handle tools, how to pace themselves through long days, how to read the land. One farmer, an older man named Mr. Callahan whose sons were both fighting in Europe, found himself talking with a prisoner named Luca during a water break. Luca spoke broken English learned from his uncle in New York. Mr. Callahan spoke no Italian. They communicated in fragments, gestures, half-sentences, but somehow a conversation emerged. Luca asked about Colorado winters. Mr. Callahan asked about Italian crops. They discovered they both grew tomatoes though the varieties were different. It was not friendship. It was something simpler and perhaps more profound. The recognition that beneath uniforms and nationalities and political allegiances, certain experiences transcended everything else. Inside the camp, other forms of community began to develop. The prisoners organized themselves not by military rank, which had dissolved in the chaos of surrender, but by region and skill. Sicilians gravitated toward each other, speaking their dialect and sharing food packages sent from home via the Red Cross. Romans formed their own circle. Northern Italians, more reserved, kept to themselves initially but gradually merged with the others as the boundaries softened. Men with skills found purposes. A former tailor in Milan began repairing uniforms, setting up a small workstation in his barracks where men brought torn clothes and traded cigarettes or extra bread for his services. A mechanic from Turin volunteered to help maintain the camp's vehicles, earning the grudging respect of the motor pool sergeant who admitted the Italian knew his way around an engine better than most of the American privates. A music teacher from Florence managed to acquire a battered guitar and began playing in the evenings, drawing crowds of prisoners who sat in the dirt and listened to songs from home, folk melodies and opera arias and popular tunes that reminded them of better times. The music drifted through the camp, audible even to the guards in their towers, and some nights the Americans stood listening too, recognizing nothing but moved nonetheless by the sound of men trying to hold on to something beautiful in the middle of captivity. Food became another side of connection, one of the most fundamental. The camp kitchen, initially run by American cooks who approached meals with the grim efficiency of institutional feeding, was gradually turned over to Italian prisoners who volunteered for the assignment. The transformation was immediate. The same rations, prepared with care and technique, became palatable. Olive oil appeared through mysterious channels, probably traded from work details or sent in Red Cross packages. Garlic made its way into stews. Bread improved dramatically when an Italian baker took over the ovens. The guards noticed. The entire camp noticed. Mealtime became less of an ordeal and more of an event. Men lingered in the mess hall, talking over coffee, savoring food that reminded them of home. The Italian cooks took pride in their work, treating the kitchen like a restaurant rather than a prison operation. They argued about recipes, debated the proper way to cook beans, competed to make the best soup from terrible ingredients. Captain Morrison, the camp commander, was a pragmatic man who understood that well-fed prisoners caused fewer problems than hungry ones. He approved of the Italian kitchen crew, noting in his reports that morale had improved significantly since the change. But he also noticed something else, something harder to quantify. The camp felt different. Less tense. More settled. The invisible line between captor and captive had not disappeared, but it had shifted, softened, become something more permeable. By the summer of 1943, 6 months into Trinidad's operation, the camp had developed its own culture, its own rhythms, its own unwritten rules that existed alongside the official ones. Prisoners and guards had settled into routines that depended on mutual cooperation. Escape attempts, initially feared by the camp administration, were rare and half-hearted. Where would they go? The high desert offered no cover, and most of the prisoners had no desire to flee into a country they did not understand, with no money, no contacts, and no prospects of reaching home. Instead they adapted. They made the camp into something livable. They built small gardens outside their barracks, growing tomatoes and peppers in the Colorado soil. They organized football matches that drew crowds of spectators, both prisoners and off-duty guards. They created a makeshift theater company that performed Italian comedies, improvising sets and costumes, drawing laughter from men who had forgotten what it felt like to laugh. The transformation was subtle, incremental, almost invisible day by day. But looking back across those months, what had seemed temporary and hostile had become something else. Not home. Not freedom. But a place where men existed as more than prisoners, where identity could be rebuilt one small gesture at a time. And in that space, against all expectations, something surprising began to grow. The first snow arrived in late October, weeks earlier than the guards expected. The Italian prisoners stood at the barracks windows, watching white flakes drift down from a gray sky, and many of them had never seen snow before. Men from Sicily, from Calabria, from the sun-scorched coasts of southern Italy, stared in disbelief as the ground turned white. Some rushed outside in just their shirts, laughing and holding out their hands to catch the cold crystals, marveling at how they melted on contact. The guards found it amusing at first, watching grown men act like children encountering a miracle. But the amusement faded when the temperature kept dropping. Winter in the Colorado high desert is brutal, a dry, bone-deep cold that settles in and does not relent until spring. The prisoners, accustomed to Mediterranean winters, were unprepared. They huddled in barracks heated by wood stoves that barely took the edge off the chill. At night, men piled extra blankets on their bunks and still woke shivering. The camp administration scrambled to issue winter gear, coats and gloves and wool hats that arrived slowly from military supply depots. In the meantime, the prisoners improvised. They stuffed newspaper inside their uniforms for insulation. They wore multiple layers of everything they owned. They learned to keep moving, to work through the cold rather than fight it. The men who had grown up in northern Italy, in the Alps or the Po Valley, taught the others how to survive, sharing techniques passed down through generations of farmers who had endured harsh winters. But the cold did something unexpected. It forced them closer together. In the barracks at night, men who had previously kept to themselves began gathering around the wood stoves, drawn by the heat and by the need for company. They told stories to pass the time, recounting childhood memories, family histories, experiences from before the war. A fisherman from Genoa described pulling nets in the pre-dawn darkness, the smell of salt and diesel and coffee from a thermos his father always brought. A carpenter from Milan talked about building cabinets from walnut, how the wood grain determined everything, how you had to listen to the material. The stories created a kind of shared archive, a collective memory that existed only in those barracks, spoken in Italian dialects that blended together in the warmth of the stove's glow. Men learned each other's histories, the names of villages they would never visit, the details of lives they would never witness. In the process they became less isolated, less alone. The guards noticed this too. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled across the plains and the temperature dropped below zero, off-duty soldiers would sometimes slip into the prisoner barracks, not to enforce rules but to escape the cold themselves. The guard stations, though equipped with heaters, were drafty and exposed. The prisoner barracks, crowded and warm from body heat and stoves, were more comfortable. At first, these visits were awkward, tense, neither side sure how to behave. The prisoners would fall silent when a guard entered, uncertain whether they were about to be reprimanded. The guards, rifles left outside or held loosely, stood near the door, unsure whether they were welcome. But gradually, as the winter dragged on and the visits became routine, the awkwardness faded. Corporal Hayes started bringing a deck of cards. He taught a group of prisoners how to play poker, using matchsticks as chips since real gambling was prohibited. The prisoners taught him Scopa, an Italian card game that Hayes claimed was impossible to understand but kept playing anyway. The games became regular events, small gatherings around a table where rank and nationality mattered less than the cards in your hand. Language barriers, initially insurmountable, began to dissolve through necessity and repetition. The prisoners picked up English words slowly and imperfectly, learning the vocabulary of daily life: food, work, cold, tired, tomorrow. The guards learned basic Italian phrases, mostly commands at first but gradually expanding to include greetings, jokes, expressions of frustration or satisfaction. The result was a hybrid communication, part English, part Italian, part gesture, entirely functional. A prisoner named Salvatore, a former schoolteacher from Turin who spoke passable English, became an informal translator, mediating conversations between guards and prisoners, smoothing over misunderstandings, facilitating the small negotiations that kept the camp running smoothly. Salvatore was not officially appointed to this role, but everyone recognized his value. Guards sought him out when they needed something explained. Prisoners came to him when they had questions about rules or requests to submit. Captain Morrison noticed Salvatore's role and made it official, appointing him as prisoner liaison with a small office in the administration building and permission to move freely within the camp. It was a position of trust, and Salvatore took it seriously, understanding that his credibility with both sides depended on fairness. He advocated for prisoners when complaints were legitimate and explained to prisoners when requests were impossible. He became a bridge, one of several that winter built between the two sides. Christmas arrived cold and clear, the sky a brilliant blue above white mountains. The camp administration had approved a Christmas celebration, following Red Cross guidelines that allowed prisoners to observe religious holidays. The Italian prisoners organized a midnight mass, constructing a makeshift altar in one of the recreation halls, decorating it with evergreen branches cut from the surrounding hills and candles obtained through official channels. The priest was a prisoner himself, Father Antonio from a village outside Naples, who had been conscripted as a chaplain and captured with his unit. He had no vestments, no proper altar equipment, no missal beyond a battered prayer book he carried in his coat. But he had his voice and his memory, and a deep belief that God existed even here, behind wire, in a frozen desert thousands of miles from home. The Mass drew every Catholic prisoner in the camp and several guards as well, some of them Catholic themselves, others simply curious. They stood together in the cold hall, breath visible in the lamplight, and listened as Father Antonio led the service in Latin, the ancient words echoing off wooden walls. Men who had not prayed in years found themselves praying. Men who had lost faith found themselves, if not believing then at least hoping. After the Mass, the Italian cooks had prepared a feast, or as close to a feast as camp rations allowed. They had saved ingredients for weeks, hoarded sugar and butter and flour, traded favors for extra provisions. The result was a meal that included pasta made by hand, sauce simmered for hours, bread that tasted almost like what they remembered from home. They invited the guards to join them, an unprecedented gesture that broke protocol but felt right. Captain Morrison approved it. He understood that this meal meant more than food. It meant survival, not just of bodies but of something deeper, the preservation of identity and culture and humanity in a place designed to contain and control. The guards who attended ate quietly, aware they were witnessing something important, something that transcended the mechanics of captivity. That night, after the meal, after the dishes were washed and the hall cleaned, a group of prisoners gathered outside despite the cold. They sang Christmas carols in Italian, traditional songs their grandparents had taught them, melodies that carried across the compound and out into the desert night. The guards in the towers heard them and did not call for silence. Some of them sang along with American carols, different songs in different languages that somehow harmonized in the darkness. It was not a planned moment of unity. It was not orchestrated or symbolic. It was simply what happened when men, far from home and surrounded by strangers, reached for something familiar and found themselves reaching together. The winter continued its slow passage. January brought more snow, February brought bitter wind, and March arrived with the promise of thaw still weeks away. But inside the camp, something had fundamentally changed. The relationship between prisoners and guards had evolved from wary coexistence into something more complex, a web of small connections and mutual dependencies that made the place function as more than just a prison. Work details continued through the winter, though the agricultural labor had ended with the harvest. Prisoners were assigned to maintenance projects, road repair, construction tasks for local communities that paid the U.S. government for the labor. They worked alongside American civilians, small contractors and public works crews who gradually stopped seeing them as enemies and started seeing them as workers. The quality of their work spoke for itself. Inside the wire, the daily routines had become comfortable, almost normal. Men knew what to expect from each day. They had established roles, responsibilities, small territories of autonomy within the broader structure of captivity. The barracks had been personalized with makeshift decorations, photographs, drawings, small objects that transformed generic spaces into places that felt inhabited rather than merely occupied. The camp had become, improbably, a community. Not by design, not through any official policy, but through the accumulated weight of small choices made daily by both prisoners and guards. Choices to see each other as people rather than categories. Choices to cooperate rather than resist. Choices to make the best of a situation neither side had wanted but both had to navigate. And in that community, in that strange village of wire and wood in the middle of nowhere, men who had been enemies discovered they could be something else. Spring came late to the Colorado high desert, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape overnight. The snow melted into streams that carved new channels in the hard earth. Wildflowers appeared in unexpected places, splashes of color against brown soil. The air warmed gradually, losing its knife-edge cold, becoming something you could breathe without pain. The Italian prisoners felt the change like a physical release. Winter had been endurance. Spring was possibility. Men emerged from barracks where they had spent months huddled against the cold and stood in the sun, faces turned upward, absorbing heat like it was medicine. And someone, no one later remembered exactly who, suggested planting a garden. The idea spread through the camp quickly. These were men from agricultural regions, from villages where everyone grew something, where food came from the ground rather than from stores, where working with soil was not a hobby but a fundamental skill. They had been living on army rations for a year, food that sustained but did not satisfy, meals that filled stomachs but left them hungry for flavors they remembered from home. A delegation approached Captain Morrison with the proposal. They wanted to turn a section of unused ground near the barracks into vegetable gardens. They would do all the work themselves using their own time, asking only for seeds and basic tools. They promised it would not interfere with their assigned duties. They emphasized it would improve morale, give them purpose beyond labor details and recreation hours. Morrison considered the request carefully. There was no regulation against it, nothing in the Geneva Convention that prohibited prisoners from gardening. It might actually reduce his problems if the prisoners had a productive outlet for their energy. And the vegetables, if they actually grew, could supplement camp rations, reducing costs. From every practical angle it made sense. He approved it. The transformation that followed was remarkable. A strip of ground that had been nothing but scrub and stones became dozens of small plots, carefully marked out and claimed by groups of prisoners who organized themselves by region and preference. Sicilians pooled their efforts on one large plot. Tuscans took another section. Northerners claimed a third. Each group approached the work differently, arguing about techniques, debating the best way to prepare soil in this strange Colorado dirt that was nothing like what they knew from home. American guards watched with bemused interest as Italian prisoners attacked the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They borrowed wheelbarrows to haul away rocks. They dug trenches for irrigation, diverting water from a nearby stream. They built makeshift fences from scrap wood to mark boundaries and protect young plants from rabbits. The work was voluntary, done during free time, yet men showed up with the dedication of professional farmers. Seeds arrived through a combination of official requests and improvisation. Some came from the Red Cross. Some were purchased through the camp canteen. Some appeared mysteriously, probably traded from work details where prisoners had befriended local farmers who slipped them packets of tomato seeds or pepper seeds or herb seeds they had saved from their own gardens. Planting day was approached with ritual seriousness. Men knelt in their plots, hands in the soil, placing each seed with care, patting the earth gently, watering with rationed amounts from buckets carried from the camp's supply. They marked each row with small wooden stakes labeled in Italian: pomodori, pepperoni, basilico, zucchine. The labels were unnecessary, each man knew exactly what he had planted and where, but the names mattered, the written evidence that this was their work, their garden, their small claim to agency. The first green shoots appeared within days, tender and fragile, pushing up through the soil like miracles. Prisoners checked their plots obsessively morning and evening, watching for signs of growth or distress. They debated watering schedules. They argued about whether to thin the seedlings or let them compete. They shared advice and criticism with equal enthusiasm. The guards found themselves drawn into the project. Some had farming backgrounds themselves, rural men who knew how to read plants and weather. They offered suggestions, sometimes solicited, sometimes not. A guard named Private Dennison, who grew up on a potato farm in Idaho, showed the Tuscans how to hill their tomatoes properly. A sergeant from Iowa explained the importance of mulch in dry climates. The technical discussions transcended language barriers through shared gestures and the universal language of agriculture. As spring progressed into early summer, the gardens exploded into life. Tomatoes ripened from green to red. Peppers hung heavy from bushy plants. Zucchini grew with such abundance that prisoners started giving them away, unable to eat them all. Fresh basil released its scent into the air, transforming the corner of the camp into something that smelled like Italy, like memory, like home. The first harvest was celebrated with a feast prepared by the Italian kitchen crew using vegetables picked that morning. Fresh tomato sauce, still warm, spooned over pasta. Grilled peppers dressed with olive oil and garlic. Salads of lettuce and herbs. The meal was shared with guards who had helped with the project, an informal gathering that mixed prisoners and Americans in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Captain Morrison attended and made a short speech translated by Salvatore, acknowledging the prisoners' work and thanking them for their contribution to camp life. The prisoners responded with applause, not perfunctory but genuine, recognition of a commander who had allowed them this dignity. It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but it marked something significant: the emergence of mutual respect built on practical cooperation rather than enforced obedience. The gardens became more than just sources of food. They became social spaces, gathering points where men worked side by side, talked about everything and nothing, built friendships based on shared labor. Prisoners who had barely known each other formed bonds over vegetables. They traded tips, shared harvests, helped each other with problems. The gardens created networks of obligation and reciprocity, the fundamental structure of community. Even men who had no interest in farming found themselves drawn to the gardens in the evening, walking the rows, admiring the work, enjoying the greenness and life in the middle of the desert. It was peaceful there, away from the barracks and the constant presence of fences. The gardens represented something hopeful, the possibility that even in captivity, growth was possible, that beauty could exist alongside constraint. The guards noticed this too. Some began spending their breaks near the gardens, sitting on the ground in the shade of the barracks, watching the prisoners work. Conversations started naturally in those moments, casual exchanges about weather or plants or home. The setting made it easier somehow, removed some of the formality that came with structured interactions. One afternoon, a prisoner named Marco was harvesting tomatoes when Corporal Hayes approached and asked, in broken Italian, if the variety was San Marzano. Marco was so surprised by the question, by the attempt to use his language and by the knowledge of tomato varieties, that he responded in English equally broken, explaining they were actually Roma tomatoes but similar to San Marzano. Hayes nodded and said his grandmother, who had immigrated from Napoli, grew San Marzanos in her garden in Colorado Springs and he missed them. The conversation that followed was halting and imperfect, full of misunderstandings and laughter, but it established something important. They were not just guard and prisoner. They were two men talking about tomatoes, about grandmothers, about food and memory and the things that connected people across oceans and wars. The moment was brief, but Marco remembered it long afterward as the first time an American guard had spoken to him as an equal. By midsummer, the gardens were thriving beyond anyone's expectations. The combination of good soil, careful attention, and the intensity of Colorado sunshine produced yields that surprised even experienced farmers. The prisoners expanded their plots, reclaiming more ground, planting successive crops to extend the harvest into fall. They shared their abundance with the camp, with the guards, with local families who were invited to take vegetables in exchange for seeds or tools for next year. The garden project had become a point of pride for everyone involved. Visitors to the camp, military inspectors and Red Cross representatives, were invariably shown the gardens as evidence of the camp's success. Captain Morrison included photographs of the plots in his reports to headquarters, noting improved morale and reduced food costs as tangible benefits. But the real impact was harder to quantify. The gardens had given the prisoners agency, the ability to create something rather than simply endure. They had provided a common purpose that transcended the imposed purpose of labor details. They had created beauty in a place designed for containment. And they had done something else, something almost invisible but profound. They had given the men a reason to think about tomorrow. When you plant a garden, you are making a commitment to the future. You are saying that you believe there will be a harvest, that you will be there to see it, that time will pass and life will continue. 4 men living in the suspended present of captivity, unsure when or how the war would end, unsure what would happen to them when it did, the act of planting was an act of faith. The gardens anchored them to the present while allowing them to imagine a future. And in doing so they made captivity something more than mere waiting. They made it a life, imperfect and constrained but lived nonetheless. August 1943 brought news that changed everything, though it arrived in fragments. Rumors whispered between work details and guard posts before official confirmation came through military channels. Italy had overthrown Mussolini. The fascist regime had collapsed. The new government was negotiating with the Allies. The Italian prisoners at Camp Trinidad heard the news with a confusion so deep it bordered on paralysis. For 20 years Mussolini had been Italy. The state, the government, the future, all tied to a single man who now, suddenly, was gone. Some prisoners refused to believe it, insisting it was Allied propaganda designed to break their morale. Others wept openly, though whether from relief or grief or simple overwhelm was impossible to say. Salvatore, the prisoner liaison, was called to Captain Morrison's office and given the official details. Italy had signed an armistice. The war for Italy was over. But the prisoner status was complicated. They were still enemy combatants, still legally prisoners of war, still bound by the same Geneva Convention rules. Nothing about their captivity would change immediately. They would remain at Trinidad until decisions were made at much higher levels about what to do with Italian prisoners now that Italy had switched sides. The announcement to the camp was made that evening. All prisoners assembled in the recreation yard, guards stationed around the perimeter more from habit than necessity. Captain Morrison spoke in English, Salvatore translated, and the words hung in the summer air like something too heavy to process. The war was over for them, but they were still here, still behind wire, still uncertain about when they might go home. The reaction was not celebration. It was a kind of numb disbelief, a collective uncertainty about what this meant, whether it was good news or simply a different kind of bad news. Men stood in silence, trying to absorb the information, trying to understand its implications for their lives. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Men lay awake on their bunks, staring at ceilings, lost in private calculations about what came next. Would they be released? Would they be sent back to Italy? Would they be reclassified as allies and asked to fight against Germany? The questions multiplied faster than answers could form. But in the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The prisoners, freed from the psychological burden of fighting for a regime they had never fully believed in, began to relax in ways they had not been able to before. The armistice removed the last traces of ideological commitment, the lingering sense that they should be loyal to something beyond their own survival. Now, officially, they were simply men waiting for the war to end completely so they could go home. The change was subtle but pervasive. Conversations became more open, less guarded. Men spoke more freely about their doubts, their experiences, the things they had witnessed that did not match official narratives. A prisoner named Giacomo, who had kept his opinions carefully hidden, admitted he had never supported Mussolini, that his family had been socialists before the fascists made such affiliations dangerous, that he had been drafted against his will and fought only because the alternative was prison or worse. Others shared similar stories. The collective unmasking revealed that most of the men had been soldiers only in the technical sense, ordinary people swept into a war they did not understand for reasons they had never fully believed. The armistice gave them permission to acknowledge this, to admit that their captivity was in many ways a relief, that they had no desire to return to a war that had destroyed so much for so little. Captain Morrison watched these developments carefully and made a decision that would define the final phase of Camp Trinidad's operation. He issued new orders relaxing some of the camp's restrictions. Work details could be extended, allowing prisoners who wished to spend more time on local farms and be paid slightly more. Recreation hours were increased. The canteen was allowed to stock a wider variety of goods. Most significantly, prisoners who demonstrated trustworthiness could be granted supervised passes to visit the town of Trinidad itself. The passes were limited, carefully monitored, and required prisoners to remain with their assigned guard at all times. But they were unprecedented. Within weeks, small groups of Italian prisoners were walking the streets of Trinidad, visiting shops, eating in diners, experiencing American civilian life firsthand. The town's initial reaction was mixed. Some residents objected, unable to separate prisoner from enemy in their minds. But others, particularly the merchants who benefited from the additional business and the farmers who depended on prisoner labor, welcomed them cautiously. The prisoners, aware they were ambassadors for the entire camp, behaved with scrupulous politeness, determined not to betray Morrison's trust. A prisoner named Luigi, a barber from Palermo, was allowed to work in a local barbershop on weekends, under supervision, cutting hair for civilians who were curious enough to try an enemy barber. Luigi worked with the precision of a craftsman, treating each customer like royalty, and within weeks had developed a loyal following. People requested him specifically, impressed by his skill and charmed by his broken English and obvious effort to please. The barbershop became a small bridge between worlds. Men who would never have imagined sitting in a chair while an Italian prisoner held a razor to their throat found themselves doing exactly that, discovering that Luigi was just a barber, that his hands were steady and his conversation pleasant, that nationality mattered less than competence and kindness. Similar patterns developed elsewhere. Italian prisoners working in local businesses, always under guard but gradually trusted with more responsibility, demonstrated that they were not dangerous, not radical, not monsters in enemy uniforms but ordinary men trying to make the best of extraordinary circumstances. The guards, many of whom had formed genuine friendships with prisoners over months of close contact, vouched for them, eased interactions, translated not just words but intentions. By late August, the boundaries between the camp and the town had become more permeable than anyone had anticipated. Prisoners were invited to community events, church suppers, baseball games. They attended with guards who had stopped being watchdogs and had become something closer to companions. The locals grew accustomed to seeing Italian prisoners in town, stopped staring, started waving, occasionally struck up conversations that revealed shared interests and surprising commonalities. A farmer named Mr. Patterson invited a group of prisoners to his ranch for Sunday dinner, an invitation Captain Morrison approved after careful consideration. The prisoners arrived nervous, uncertain how to behave in an American home, but Mrs. Patterson met them at the door with warmth and ushered them inside as if they were neighbors rather than enemy soldiers. The meal was simple but abundant: roast chicken and potatoes and fresh vegetables from the prisoners' own gardens, which Mr. Patterson had been buying at the camp. They ate together, Americans and Italians, guards and prisoners, passing dishes and making conversation through Salvatore's translations and many hand gestures. The Pattersons asked about Italy, about families, about plans after the war. The prisoners asked about Colorado, about ranching, about American customs that confused them. The dinner lasted hours, stretching into evening, and when it ended, Mr. Patterson shook each prisoner's hand and said they were welcome back anytime. The prisoners returned to camp that night changed by the experience. They had been guests, not prisoners. They had been treated with dignity, not suspicion. They had been welcomed into an American home and shown kindness that had no practical justification, no strategic purpose, simply human decency extended across the deepest possible divides. Word of the dinner spread through the camp and through the town. Other families extended similar invitations. The pattern repeated, each dinner or visit creating small threads of connection between the camp and the community. The threads accumulated, strengthening, until they formed something like a web, a network of relationships that held everyone together in ways that transcended the official categories of prisoner and guard, enemy and American. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of fall color in the distant mountains. The gardens began their decline, plants exhausted from summer production, though late-season crops still produced enough to keep the kitchen supplied. The prisoners harvested what remained, saving seeds for next year's planting in a gesture that assumed they would still be here, still maintaining the gardens they had built. But the assumption was beginning to crack. News from Europe indicated the war was intensifying. American forces were pushing into Italy. The question of what would happen to Italian prisoners in America became more urgent as politicians and military officials debated their status. Some argued they should be sent home immediately now that Italy was an ally. Others insisted they should remain available as laborers. Still others proposed forming them into labor battalions to support the Allied war effort. The prisoners at Trinidad listened to these debates through the fragmentary news that reached them and felt their future being decided by distant bureaucrats who had never met them, never seen the gardens, never shared a meal or played cards or learned their names. They waited, understanding that captivity had always been temporary but uncertain when or how it would end. In the meantime they continued living. They worked their jobs, tended their gardens, spent evenings in familiar routines. They played bocce in the recreation yard and cards in the barracks. They attended Mass with Father Antonio and English lessons with a guard who volunteered to teach. They wrote letters home when mail service resumed and received replies from families who had not known whether they were alive. The camp had become a strange kind of home, unwanted but comfortable, constraining but familiar. The men had adapted so completely that the prospect of leaving created anxiety as much as relief. This place had shaped them, changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. They had arrived as soldiers. They were leaving as something else. He considered, choosing his words carefully through Salvatore's translation. We came here expecting punishment. We found something else. We found that enemies could become, not friends perhaps, but not enemies either. We found that Americans were not what we were told. We found that maybe people are just people regardless of what flag they fight under. The colonel closed his journal, nodded once and moved to another table. The same question, repeated throughout the meal, yielded similar answers. The prisoners spoke carefully but honestly, acknowledging the strangeness of their situation, the unexpected decency they had encountered, the ways captivity had changed their understanding of the world. That afternoon the colonel called a meeting with Captain Morrison, the senior guards, and Salvatore as representative of the prisoners. He spread papers across Morrison's desk, intelligence reports and policy memos and casualty lists from Italy, evidence of a country tearing itself apart as German forces occupied the north and fought Allied advances from the south. Your prisoners can't go home, the colonel said flatly. Not yet. Italy is a battlefield. Sending them back would mean sending them into chaos, likely death. So they stay here at least until the situation stabilizes. Morrison nodded, having suspected as much. The colonel continued. But there's a question we're wrestling with in Washington. These men are technically co-belligerents now. They could be useful. We could form them into labor battalions, send them to Europe to support the invasion. Free up American troops for combat. It makes strategic sense. He paused, looking at each person in the room. But I've visited a dozen camps in the past month, and I've seen something here I haven't seen anywhere else. You've built something. I don't know what to call it. A functioning community, maybe? It's remarkable and completely contrary to standard POW camp operation. So before I make my recommendation to Washington, I want to know, would your prisoners volunteer for labor battalions in Europe? Or would they refuse? The question was directed at Morrison, but everyone understood it was really asking about the bonds that had formed, whether loyalty to this place, to these people, to this strange accidental community would override the possibility of freedom and purpose beyond the wire. Morrison turned to Salvatore. I can't answer for them. You'll need to ask. The assembly was called that evening. All prisoners gathered in the recreation yard under a sky turning purple with sunset. Salvatore stood on a makeshift platform and explained the situation in Italian, translating the colonel's words, presenting the choice clearly: remain at Trinidad indefinitely as prisoners, or volunteer for labor battalions supporting the Allied war effort in Europe. The silence that followed was profound. 500 men stood motionless, processing the implications, weighing possibilities against uncertainties. To volunteer meant leaving this place they had made livable. It meant returning to war zones, to danger, to the chaos of combat even if they would not be fighting. But it also meant purpose, contribution, perhaps eventual freedom. A prisoner named Carlo raised his hand, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. If we volunteer, do we go together? Or do they split us up? Salvatore translated the question to the colonel, who had remained for the assembly. The colonel considered, then responded. Probably together. It's logistically simpler to keep intact units. Another question from Giuseppe the farmer. And the guards? Do any of them come with us? The colonel frowned, clearly not having considered this angle. That would be unusual. Why would it matter? Giuseppe spoke carefully. Because we trust them. We know them. If we go into unknown situations, having familiar faces, people we've worked with, people who know us, that matters. That changes everything. The colonel looked at Morrison, who shrugged slightly, acknowledging the unexpected complication. The colonel made another note in his journal and said, I'll see what's possible. No promises. Over the next week, the prisoners debated among themselves. The arguments were passionate, divided, revealing different priorities and fears. Younger men, restless after months of captivity, favored volunteering, eager for anything that offered movement and purpose. Older men, tired and cautious, preferred to wait out the war in safety. Some men wanted to contribute to the Allied cause, feeling that working against Germany was a way to atone for having fought for fascism. Others simply wanted to survive until they could go home. The discussions happened in barracks, in the gardens, during work details. Men who had barely spoken to each other before found themselves in intense conversations about duty, family, risk, hope. The community that had formed over 18 months was now being tested by a choice that could tear it apart or strengthen it further. Captain Morrison called together his senior guards and posed a question of his own. If the prisoners volunteer and are sent to Europe, who among you would be willing to go with them as supervisors? The guards looked at each other in surprise. Going to Europe meant leaving Colorado, leaving families, stepping closer to the war they had been avoiding through their assignment to this safe backwater camp. It was not a question any of them had expected to face. But Corporal Hayes spoke up immediately. I'd go. I know these men. I trust them. If they're going into something difficult, they should have people with them who understand them. Other guards nodded, adding their names to the list. Not all of them, some had families they could not leave, others had no desire to get closer to combat. But enough volunteered that Morrison knew he could assemble a cadre of familiar faces if the opportunity arose. The final vote happened on a Sunday evening, conducted by secret ballot to allow each prisoner to choose without peer pressure. Salvatore and Captain Morrison counted the results together, neither speaking until the final tally was complete. 317 prisoners voted to volunteer for labor battalions. 183 voted to remain at Trinidad. The majority chose movement over safety, purpose over comfort, the unknown over the familiar. The colonel received the results by telegram and responded 3 days later with orders that surprised everyone. The volunteers would be formed into the Trinidad Labor Battalion, a unit that would depart for Europe in January to support Allied operations in Italy. Captain Morrison would command the unit, with his volunteering guards serving as supervisors. The prisoners remaining at Trinidad would continue camp operations until the war's end. The decision split the camp community for the first time since its formation. Men who had lived side by side for over a year were suddenly on different paths, one group leaving, one group staying. Friendships that had formed across that divide now had to navigate separation. The volunteers and the remainers ate at different tables, slept in separate barracks, began living in separate temporal zones, one focused on preparation, one on continuation. But the split did not create hostility. Instead, it created a kind of wistful recognition that what they had built together was not permanent, that the artificial village inside the wire was always going to dissolve eventually. The only question had been how and when. December arrived cold and clear, winter returning with the same brutal beauty as the year before. The volunteers prepared for departure, receiving new uniforms, medical examinations, briefings about what to expect in Europe. The remainers continued their routines, maintaining the gardens even as they went dormant, tending the life they had built while knowing it would never be the same. On Christmas Eve, the entire camp gathered one last time for Mass with Father Antonio. He spoke about journeys, about the importance of carrying home in your heart regardless of where your body travels. He blessed the volunteers and the remainers equally, acknowledging that both groups were making legitimate choices, that there was no correct answer to impossible questions. After the service, the prisoners and guards shared a final meal together, an elaborate feast prepared over days by the kitchen crew. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the company, knowing this would be their last gathering as a complete community. Men exchanged addresses, made promises to write, swore they would find each other after the war and share wine together in Italy or Colorado or wherever life took them. Some of those promises would be kept. Most would fade like all promises made in extreme circumstances, sincere in the moment but impossible to maintain across the distances that were coming. But the making of them mattered, the acknowledgement that what had happened here was worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward. January 1945. The wind that morning cut through every layer of clothing, carrying snow horizontally across the camp parade ground where the Trinidad Labor Battalion assembled for final inspection. 317 Italian volunteers stood in formation, wearing American work uniforms with distinctive triangular patches identifying them as co-belligerents. They were still prisoners technically, but the designation had shifted to something more ambiguous. Allies under constraint, volunteers under guard, men who had chosen to step toward the war rather than wait for it to end. Captain Morrison walked the ranks slowly, examining each man, seeing individuals rather than a unit. He knew their names, their stories, the particular quirks and strengths that made each one who they was. Giuseppe the farmer, steady and wise. Carlo the mechanic, brilliant with engines. Luigi the barber, precise and careful. Marco, Salvatore, Antonio, Giovanni, 317 men who had transformed from enemies into something he could not quite name but recognized as important. The remaining prisoners stood outside the wire, gathered along the fence to watch the departure. They had voted to stay for their own reasons, survival and caution and exhaustion, but watching the volunteers prepare to leave created a complicated mixture of relief and envy. They would be safe here, warm and fed and far from combat. But the volunteers would be moving, doing, participating in the conclusion of the war rather than waiting for it to arrive. The trucks arrived at dawn, a convoy of military transport vehicles that would carry the battalion to the train station in Trinidad, the first leg of a journey that would take them across the country to embarkation ports and eventually to Italy. The men loaded their minimal belongings, duffel bags containing spare clothes, personal items, letters from home that had arrived too late to answer. Before boarding, the volunteers walked the camp one final time, saying goodbye to the gardens now buried under snow, to the barracks that had sheltered them, to the small spaces they had made their own. Some men knelt at their garden plots, touching the frozen earth, planting nothing but leaving something nonetheless. Gratitude, memory, a silent acknowledgement that this ground had given them more than vegetables. The townspeople of Trinidad arrived as well, despite the cold and early hour. Farmers who had employed the prisoners on work details, merchants who had sold to them in shops, families who had invited them for dinners, they came to the camp gates and waved, called out goodbyes, handed up packages of food and cigarettes and letters of recommendation for after the war. The bonds that had formed extended beyond the wire, into the community, creating a network of connection that would outlast the physical presence of the camp. Mr. Patterson, the rancher who had hosted the first Sunday dinner, pushed through the crowd and found Giuseppe standing by a truck. He pressed an envelope into the Italian's hand and said, through Salvatore's translation, "This is a letter for after the war. If you come back to Colorado, bring this to my ranch. There's work for you if you want it. Good work, honest wages. You'd be welcome." Giuseppe took the envelope with shaking hands, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the generosity of this offer from a man who owed him nothing. He shook Patterson's hand, then pulled him into an embrace, two farmers from opposite sides of the world acknowledging their fundamental similarity. Similar scenes unfolded across the convoy. Corporal Hayes found Marco and said in careful Italian practiced over months, "Stay attento, amico." Be careful, friend. Marco nodded, understanding the sentiment beyond the words, and responded in equally careful English, "You too. See you after." The loading took an hour, prolonged by goodbyes and last conversations and the reluctance of everyone involved to acknowledge that this moment was actually happening. But finally Captain Morrison gave the order and the trucks started their engines, diesel smoke rising into the cold air. The convoy pulled out slowly, wheels crunching on frozen ground, past the guards in the towers who stood at attention in salute, past the prisoners at the fence who waved and shouted messages, past the townspeople who had gathered to witness this departure. The trucks rolled through the camp gates and turned onto the main road, heading toward Trinidad and then toward whatever came next. Inside the trucks, the Italian volunteers sat in silence, watching the camp recede through the canvas openings, watching the wire and the wooden towers and the barracks where they had lived shrink and disappear behind them. 18 months of their lives contained in that space, 18 months that had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. The train ride to New York took 4 days, crossing a continent the prisoners had never seen. They pressed against windows, watching America pass by, endless fields and industrial cities and small towns that looked like Trinidad, recognizing the scale and wealth and diversity of the country they had fought against and learning, through observation, why the war had been unwinnable from the start. In New York, they boarded a transport ship crowded with American troops headed to Europe. The crossing was rough, winter storms making the Atlantic treacherous, but the Italians who had survived worse conditions in North Africa endured the voyage with stoic calm. They spent the days on deck when weather permitted, looking east toward the continent they had left 2 years ago and wondering what they would find upon return. Italy, when they finally arrived in Naples, was unrecognizable. The city lay in ruins, buildings reduced to rubble, streets torn up, the harbor clogged with sunken ships. The population moved through the destruction like ghosts, hollow-eyed and desperate, begging from the American soldiers who controlled the city. The prisoners, now Labor Battalion members, stared at the devastation and felt the full weight of what their country had endured while they were safe in Colorado. The battalion was assigned to reconstruction work, clearing rubble, rebuilding roads, repairing infrastructure destroyed by combat. The labor was hard, endless, dangerous, nothing like the agricultural work they had done in America. But it was purposeful. Every stone they moved, every road they repaired, every building they helped restore brought Italy one step closer to recovery. Captain Morrison commanded the battalion with the same fairness he had shown at Trinidad, insisting his Italian workers be treated with respect, ensuring they received adequate rations, defending them against American officers who saw them only as former enemies useful for dangerous work. The guards from Trinidad, including Corporal Hayes, maintained the same relationships they had built in the camp, supervising without cruelty, working alongside the Italians when additional hands were needed. They worked through winter and into spring, following the Allied advance north, clearing roads through destroyed towns, rebuilding bridges blown by retreating Germans. The work brought them into contact with Italian civilians who reacted with confusion to the sight of Italian prisoners supervised by Americans but working voluntarily, wearing American uniforms but speaking Italian, existing in some undefined space between enemy and ally. Giuseppe worked on a reconstruction crew in a village near Florence, clearing collapsed buildings to make way for temporary housing. An old woman watched them work for days before approaching and asking, in the Tuscan dialect Giuseppe recognized from home, where they had been during the war. When Giuseppe explained, haltingly, about Trinidad and Colorado and the gardens and the choice to volunteer, the woman was silent for a long time. Then she said simply, "You were lucky. The war was harder here." The comment contained no judgment, only acknowledgement of different experiences of the same war. Giuseppe agreed. They had been lucky. Impossibly, incomprehensibly lucky. They had spent the war behind wire, safe and fed and far from the destruction that had consumed their homeland. The guilt of that luck would follow them for the rest of their lives. By summer 1945, the war in Europe ended. The Trinidad Labor Battalion continued working through the confusion of peace, helping process refugees, rebuild infrastructure, manage the chaos of demobilization. They were no longer prisoners technically but not quite free either, caught in bureaucratic limbo as military officials determined what to do with thousands of former enemy soldiers who had volunteered for Allied service. In August the announcement came. The Trinidad Labor Battalion would be disbanded. The men would be granted papers certifying their service and allowed to return home, to whatever remained of home, with the gratitude of the Allied forces. Captain Morrison delivered the news during a final assembly, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion he did not try to hide. "You came to America as enemies," he said, with Salvatore translating one last time. "You leave as men we're honored to have known. What you built at Trinidad, the community you created, the humanity you maintained, that matters more than the work you've done here. Remember that. Remember that people can be better than the circumstances that contain them." The battalion dispersed slowly over the following weeks, men heading to different regions of Italy, back to families they had not seen in years, to villages that had changed or no longer existed. Some discovered everyone they loved had died. Some found families that had survived but were fundamentally altered by privation and loss. Some returned to nothing, their homes destroyed, their communities scattered. A few, including Giuseppe, found themselves unable to settle back into Italian life. The war had displaced them too thoroughly, changed them too deeply. Giuseppe remembered the envelope from Mr. Patterson, the offer of work in Colorado, and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. He would return to America. Not as a prisoner but as an immigrant, seeking the life he had glimpsed behind wire. 1947. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. The camp stood empty, buildings intact but silent, wind moving through open doors and broken windows. The Army had decommissioned the facility after the war, removing guards and equipment but leaving the structure standing, uncertain what to do with a prisoner of war camp that no longer held prisoners or war. Giuseppe stood at the gate, which hung open on rusted hinges, and felt the strangeness of returning. He had crossed the ocean again, processed through immigration, traveled by train to Trinidad carrying Mr. Patterson's letter and little else. The ranch job was real. Patterson honored his offer. Giuseppe would start work next week. But first he needed to see this place one more time, needed to close the circle. He walked through the camp slowly, retracing familiar paths. The barracks where he had slept for 18 months, now empty and dusty, beds stripped, walls bearing the faint outlines where men had tacked photographs. The mess hall, tables still in place, ghostly gathering spot for hundreds of meals shared. The recreation yard, weeds growing through the bocce court, football goals leaning drunkenly. The gardens. Giuseppe made his way to the section of ground where his plot had been, where he and his fellow Sicilians had grown tomatoes and peppers and basil under the Colorado sun. The plots were overgrown now, covered in wild grasses and sage, no trace of cultivation visible. But Giuseppe knelt and dug his fingers into the soil, finding it still rich, still capable. He pulled seeds from his pocket, tomato seeds he had saved from the Trinidad gardens and carried with him to Italy and back to America, through war and peace and migration. He planted them carefully in the soil of his old garden, patting the earth gently, watering them with water from his canteen. It was a symbolic gesture, pointless in practical terms. No one would tend these plants. No one would harvest them. But Giuseppe needed to mark this place, to acknowledge what had happened here, to plant something as an act of remembrance rather than cultivation. He stood slowly, knees protesting, and looked around the empty camp. How many men had passed through here? How many lives had intersected in this strange village of wire? How many had discovered, as he had, that enemies could become something else if circumstances allowed? A truck approached on the road outside the camp, slowing when the driver noticed Giuseppe standing by the gate. The truck stopped and Corporal Hayes stepped out, older now, wearing civilian clothes, work boots and jeans and a jacket. He walked toward Giuseppe slowly, recognition dawning. Giuseppe? Hayes. They stood facing each other, former guard and former prisoner, in front of the empty camp where they had spent a year and a half learning each other's names. Hayes broke the silence first. I heard some of you came back. Couldn't quite believe it. Giuseppe shrugged. Italy was difficult. And someone offered me work here. Honest work. Hayes nodded, understanding the weight of those words. You staying in the area? Yes. Patterson's ranch. Good man Patterson. He'll treat you right. Hayes paused, looking at the camp. I drive past here sometimes. Never stopped before. Couldn't decide if I wanted to remember or forget. Both, Giuseppe said. We do both. They walked through the camp together, two men revisiting a place that had defined them in ways neither fully understood. Hayes pointed out the barracks where the Christmas Mass had been held. Giuseppe showed Hayes the garden plots, explained about the tomato seeds. They talked about the men they had known, what had happened to them. Some dead, casualties of the reconstruction work or the chaos of post-war Italy. Some returned to their old lives. Some vanished into the displacement of peace. Did we do something good here? Hayes asked suddenly. Or was it just captivity that happened to be comfortable? Giuseppe considered the question carefully. Maybe both. Maybe that's enough. We were enemies who learned we didn't have to be. That matters. Hayes accepted this, and they continued walking, their footsteps echoing through empty buildings that had once contained so much life, so much argument, so much food and laughter and hope. They reached the fence line and stood looking out at the mountains, blue and distant, unchanged by anything that had happened here. Will you come by the ranch sometimes? Giuseppe asked. For coffee? Yeah, Hayes said. I'd like that. They shook hands, a gesture that had changed meaning since the first time they performed it, no longer guard and prisoner but something closer to equals, maybe even friends. Giuseppe retrieved his bag from the gate and Hayes offered him a ride into town. They drove away from the empty camp, leaving it to the wind and the sage, leaving the memories embedded in the soil and the wood and the wire. In the years that followed, Camp Trinidad stood abandoned, a monument to nothing, gradually deteriorating under the weight of weather and time. The buildings collapsed, the fence rusted away, the grounds reverted to desert. The town expanded and eventually reclaimed the land, building houses and schools where barracks had stood, paving roads over the paths prisoners had walked. The people who moved into these new houses never knew what the land had held. There were no plaques, no markers, no official recognition that this had been a place where something unexpected happened, where enemies had become a community, where humanity had persisted despite circumstances designed to contain it. But Giuseppe knew. And Hayes knew. And the men who had survived Trinidad and returned to Italy carried the knowledge with them, told their children and grandchildren about the prison camp in Colorado where they had planted gardens and played cards with Americans and discovered that the enemy was not quite what they had been told. The stories were fragmentary, incomplete, probably inaccurate in details but true in essence. They described a place that should not have existed, a community that should not have formed, friendships that violated every principle of war and captivity. They described men who planted tomatoes behind wire and believed, despite everything, that the harvest would come. The harvest did come. Not the vegetables, though those had grown abundantly for 2 seasons. The other harvest, the one planted in moments of recognition and small kindnesses and shared meals, in card games and translated conversations and the slow accumulation of trust between people who should have remained strangers. That harvest was less visible but more enduring. It grew in the spaces between propaganda and reality, in the recognition that nationality and ideology mattered less than fundamental human decency, in the understanding that even enemies contained within them the possibility of connection. Giuseppe worked at the Patterson Ranch for 30 years, eventually becoming foreman, marrying an American woman, raising children who spoke English and Italian and considered themselves fully American while honoring their father's past. He never forgot Trinidad, never stopped mentioning it when the topic of the war arose, never stopped believing that what happened there mattered. Hayes returned to ranching, married his high school sweetheart, built a life in the shadow of the mountains he had never left. He and Giuseppe had coffee together regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes just a few times a year when schedules allowed. They talked about everything and nothing, old men who had known each other young, who shared a history that no one else quite understood. When Giuseppe died in 1982, Hayes was a pallbearer, carrying the coffin of a man who had arrived in America as a prisoner and left as a friend. At the funeral, Hayes stood and told the story of Trinidad to Giuseppe's children and grandchildren, many of whom had heard fragments but never the full narrative. He described the gardens, the kitchen, the Christmas Mass, the moment the Italian prisoners taught him to play scopa and he tried to teach them poker. He told them their father had been part of something rare, a community built from captivity, a family formed from enemies. He told them the camp was gone but what it represented remained, the possibility that people could choose connection over division, cooperation over conflict, humanity over the categories that usually define them. The story was received with varying degrees of interest and comprehension. Some understood its significance. Some filed it away as old man's nostalgia. Some never thought about it again. But one of Giuseppe's grandchildren, a college student studying history, began researching Camp Trinidad years later, combing through archives and military records and Red Cross reports. She found documentation of the Garden Project, photographs of Italian prisoners working in Colorado fields, letters home mentioning the surprising decency of their captors. She found Salvatore's name in records as prisoner liaison. She found Captain Morrison's reports praising the cooperative spirit of his charges. She found meal logs showing the Christmas feast, work records showing the voluntary labor, medical records showing prisoners receiving care equal to what American soldiers received. She compiled these fragments into a thesis and eventually a book, an academic study of prisoner of war camps that challenged conventional narratives about captivity and enmity. Camp Trinidad became a case study, an example of what was possible when people prioritized humanity over ideology, when systems designed for control allowed space for community. The book was read by scholars and veterans and descendants of other prisoners who had similar stories, other camps where unexpected connections formed, other moments when the mechanics of war gave way to something more fundamental. The recognition spread that Trinidad was not unique, just unusually well documented, that human decency persisted through the war in countless small places, mostly forgotten but no less real. The land where Camp Trinidad stood is now a residential neighborhood, houses with yards and swing sets, completely ordinary except for a small community garden maintained by local residents who know nothing of the larger garden that preceded theirs. Giuseppe's tomato seeds, carried from Italy to Colorado, eventually took root in that community garden, planted by Hayes before he died, a final gesture of remembrance. The tomatoes grow every summer, yielding fruit that tastes like memory, like the impossible harvest of human connection planted in the unlikeliest soil. People eat them without knowing their history, without recognizing that they are consuming not just vegetables but a story, the legacy of a place where enemies became a family, where wire and distance and ideology could not prevent recognition of fundamental similarity. And in that recognition, in those small moments of connection across impossible divides, something survived that was larger than any individual life, larger than the war, larger than the camp itself. It survived in stories told, in tomatoes planted, in the quiet insistence that people are capable of better than the worst circumstances that contain them. That enemies are never only enemies. That family can form in the strangest places. That wire is only wire. And what matters is what we choose to build on either side of it.